she sheltered a bleeding Modoc warrior from Sheriff Dalton's posse at midnight, binding his wounds by candlelight while bullets still whistled through the Oregon hills. By dawn, 50 painted warriors had surrounded her cabin, their war chief, demanding to know why a white woman had saved the life of their most wanted fugitive. What happened next would either unite two peoples in an impossible alliance, or ignite the bloodiest war the territory had ever seen.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The high desert of southeastern Oregon stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, so bright they seemed close, enough to pluck from the sky. Adelaide Addie Weston had always found peace in the vastness of this land, in the way the sagebrush whispered secrets to the wind, and the distant mountains stood like silent sentinels against the horizon. But tonight, as she rode her Mare Duchess back from delivering old Martha Jennings' baby, peace was the last thing on her mind. The gunshots had started an hour ago, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder trapped in stone. Single shots at first, then rapid volleys that spoke of a running battle. Addie had pulled Duchess to a halt on the ridge overlooking Willow Creek, her heart hammering as she tried to count the muzzle flashes in the darkness below. Too many to be a hunting party. Too organized to be claim jumpers. This was law enforcement, and they were hunting something dangerous. Or someone. Addie was no stranger to violence. In her 32 years on the frontier, she'd seen claim wars, range feuds, and the bitter aftermath of the Modoc War that had torn through this region like a plague. But there was something different about tonight's hunt, something that made her stomach clench with dread. The shots were moving steadily north, toward the reservation lands, and she could hear the baying of hounds carried on the desert wind, a manhunt. And from the sound of it, whoever they were chasing was heading straight for her property. Addie's cabin sat on 200 acres of scrubland that she'd claimed after her husband's death 5 years ago. It wasn't much, a 2-room log structure, with a barn, a well, and enough grazing land for a handful of cattle, but it was hers. More importantly, it sat right on the boundary between white settlement and Modoc territory, a no-man's land that most folks were smart enough to avoid. Most folks. But not Addie. She'd chosen this isolated spot precisely because it was isolated, because it allowed her to practice her trade without the constant judgment of townspeople, who whispered that a woman had no business setting bones and delivering babies. Out here, nobody cared that she'd learned her healing skills from a Paiute medicine woman, or that she sometimes traded with the reservation Indians when they needed medical attention they couldn't get from the government doctor. Out here, she could be herself. Until tonight, the shooting had stopped by the time Addie reached her cabin, but she could still hear the distant sound of horses and men's voices carried on the wind. She unsaddled Duchess quickly, her hands shaking as she worked by moonlight. Whatever was happening out there, she wanted no part of it. She'd learned long ago that when armed men came hunting in the darkness, innocent people had a way of ending. Up dead dot, she was halfway to her front door when she heard it, a low moan that seemed to come from the shadows beside her woodshed. Addie froze, her hand instinctively moving to the navy Colt she wore at her hip. The sound came again, weaker this time, and unmistakably human. "Who's there?" She called softly, drawing the pistol but keeping it lowered. "Show yourself." A figure stumbled out of the shadows, and Addie's breath caught in her throat. It was a young Indian man, probably not much older than 20, wearing traditional buckskin clothing that had been torn and bloodied. His long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, and his face was painted with the red and black war paint of the Modoc people. But it was the arrow shaft protruding from his left shoulder, and the rifle wound in his thigh that made Addie's healer instincts override her caution. The young warrior took 2 more steps toward her before his legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees in her dusty yard, one hand pressed against the wound in his thigh while dark blood seeped between his fingers. When he looked up at her, his eyes were bright with fever and pain, but also with something else, a fierce, desperate hope. "Please," he whispered in accented English, "help me." Addie stared at him, her mind racing. This was obviously the man Sheriff Dalton's posse had been hunting. The war paint, the wounds, the way he'd appeared like a ghost in her yard. He was a warrior, probably one of the renegades who'd been raiding settlements along the border. Helping him would make her an accessory to whatever crimes he'd committed. It would mark her as a traitor to her own people, but he was also a young man who was bleeding to death in her yard. The sound of approaching horses made the decision for her. The posse was getting closer, their voices carrying clearly in the still night air. In a few minutes they'd be here, and if they found a wounded Modoc warrior on her property, they'd assume she was part of whatever he'd done. They'd shoot first, and ask questions later, if they bothered to ask questions at all. "Can you walk?" she asked, holstering her pistol and moving toward him. The warrior tried to stand, made it halfway to his feet, and collapsed again. I can try. That's not good enough." Addie glanced toward the approaching sounds, then made her choice. She grabbed the young man under his good arm and hauled him to his feet, surprised by how much he weighed despite his lean build. "Come on, we're going inside." Getting him into the cabin was a nightmare of pain and suppressed groans. The warrior, who was taller than she'd first realized, had to lean heavily on her, and every step sent fresh blood streaming from his wounds. By the time they reached her front door, both of them were breathing hard and covered in his blood. "The cellar," Addie said, pushing open the door to reveal the narrow wooden steps that led down to her root cellar. "You'll be safe down there until they pass." The young warrior looked at the dark opening, then back at her face. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why help me?" "Because you asked," Addie replied simply. "Now move. We don't have much time." Getting him down the cellar steps was even harder than getting him into the cabin. The warrior's strength was fading fast, and twice Addie thought they were both going to tumble down the narrow stairs. But finally, they reached the bottom, and she helped him settle onto a pile of old blankets she kept stored there. "Stay quiet," she whispered, lighting a candle and setting it on an overturned crate. "No matter what you hear, don't make a sound." The warrior nodded, his eyes already starting to glaze with fever. Addie pulled a dusty bottle of whiskey from her emergency supplies and poured some on a clean cloth. "This is going to hurt," she warned, then pressed the alcohol-soaked fabric against the bullet wound in his thigh. The warrior's body went rigid, and he bit down hard on his own fist to keep from crying out. Fresh blood welled from the wound, but the bleeding was already starting to slow. The bullet had passed clean through, which was a mercy. The arrow in his shoulder would be more complicated, but that would have to wait. "What's your name?" Addie asked as she worked, trying to keep him conscious and distracted from the pain. "Kinpuwash," he whispered. "It means," strikes the water brashly. "I'm Adelaide, Addie." She finished binding the leg wound with strips torn from her petticoat. "What did you do, Kinpuwash? Why are they hunting you?" His dark eyes found hers. In the candlelight, "I defended my sister." Before Addie could ask what he meant, the sound of hoofbeats filled the yard above. Multiple horses, coming fast and hard. She could hear men's voices, rough and angry, and the jingle of spurs and gun leather. "Sheriff Dalton," she breathed, recognizing the booming voice that cut through the night air. "Weston. Adelaide Weston, come out here." Addie looked down at Kinpuwash. One more time. His eyes were closed now, but his breathing was steady. She blew out the candle and climbed back up the cellar steps, closing the trapdoor behind her and kicking the braided rug over it. When she opened her front door, she was facing a dozen armed men on horseback. Sheriff Tom Dalton sat his big buckskin, gelding in the center of the group, his badge glinting in the moonlight. He was a big man with a gray mustache and cold eyes that missed nothing.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Behind him were his regular deputies and several men Addie recognized as local ranchers and business owners from the nearest town of Lakeview. "Evening, Sheriff," Addie said, stepping out onto her small front porch. "Kind of late for a social call, isn't it?" Dalton's eyes swept over her, taking in her blood-stained dress and the way her hair had come loose from its pins. "You look like you've been busy, Mrs. Weston, delivering a baby. Martha Jennings finally had her little one. A boy, if you're interested." "That's not why we're here." One of the deputies, a young man named Charlie Barnes, who'd always made Addie uncomfortable with the way he looked at her, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "We're tracking a murdering redskin. Trail leads right to your doorstep." Addie kept her face carefully neutral. "I haven't seen any Indians tonight, Deputy Barnes. Though I did hear a lot of shooting earlier. Scared my cattle something fierce." "Don't play dumb with us, woman," growled Jake Morrison, one of the local ranchers. "That savage killed 3 good men tonight. Shot him down in cold blood at the trading post." Addie's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice steady. 3 men? What happened?" "What happened?" Sheriff Dalton said, his voice deadly quiet. "Is that some fool Indian got it in his head to start another war? Rode right into Henley's trading post tonight, bold as brass, and demanded they hand over his sister. When Henley and his boys refused, the savage opened fire. His sister?" Addie couldn't keep the surprise out of her voice. "Henley bought her fair and square from Chief Shanchan's son-in-law," Deputy Barnes said. "Pretty little squaw, maybe 16 years old. Paid good money for her, too. Had every right to keep what he bought." Addie felt sick. She knew what bought meant in this context. It meant that someone had sold a young Indian girl to a white man to be used however he saw fit. It meant slavery, rape, and worse. And it meant that Ken Pewash had been trying to rescue his sister when he'd killed those men. "Blood trail leads right here," Sheriff Dalton continued, his eyes never leaving Addie's face. "Indians wounded bad. Saw the blood myself. He came here, Mrs. Weston. Question is, did you help him?" "I told you, Sheriff, I haven't seen any Indians tonight. Then you won't mind if we search your property?" It wasn't a question. Addie stepped aside as the men dismounted and began spreading out across her small homestead. She watched with her heart pounding as they checked the barn, the chicken coop, and the small shed where she kept her tools. 2 of them even climbed up into the loft of the barn, their heavy boots making the whole structure creak. "Nothing in the barn, Sheriff," one of them called out. "Check the house," Dalton ordered. Addie had no choice but to let them inside. They stomped through her small cabin with their muddy boots, overturning her furniture and dumping out her carefully organized medicine supplies. One of them knocked over a chair, and another pulled all her blankets off the bed, looking for hidden blood stains. The whole time, Addie stood in her doorway and prayed that Ken Pewash would stay quiet. The cellar door was well hidden under the rug, but if they looked hard enough, they'd find it. And if they found it, they'd find him, and then they'd probably hang them both. "Nothing here either, Sheriff," Deputy Barnes reported, sounding disappointed. "Sheriff." Dalton studied Addie's face for a long moment. "You sure you haven't seen anything unusual tonight, Mrs. Weston? Any sign of that Indian?" "I'm sure, Sheriff. Though I have to say, I'm a little surprised you're out here hunting one man with a dozen riders. Must be some dangerous criminal." "He's a murderer," Jake Morrison snarled. "Killed 3 white men. That makes him dangerous enough. And he's not alone," another voice added. This came from a man Addie didn't recognize, a grizzled old scout with scars on his hands and a face like weathered leather. "Saw signals in the hills tonight. Smoke and mirror flashes. He's got friends out there, and they know where he is." Sheriff Dalton nodded grimly. "That's what I'm afraid of. We need to find this savage before his whole tribe comes looking for him. He looked at Addie again. You live pretty isolated out here, Mrs. Weston. Might be safer if you came into town for a few days. Until this all blows over. I appreciate the concern, Sheriff, but I'll be fine. I've got my rifle, and I know how to use it. Rifle won't do. You much good against a war party, Morrison said. I guess I'll have to hope it doesn't come to that. Sheriff Dalton studied her for another long moment, then nodded to his men. Mount up. We'll check the creek bed and then make camp at Wilson's ranch. Start fresh in the morning. As the posse rode away, Addie stood on her porch and watched their torches disappear into the darkness. Only when she was sure they were gone did she go back inside and move the rug away from the cellar door. Kinpuash was still alive, but his condition had worsened. The fever had taken hold, and he was delirious, muttering in his native tongue and thrashing weakly against the blankets. Addie brought down more candles, fresh water, and her medical supplies. The next few hours were a nightmare of blood and pain. The arrow in Kinpuash's shoulder had to come out, and it was buried deep in the muscle. Addie had to cut around the arrowhead with her sharpest knife, working by candlelight while the young warrior writhed in agony. She'd given him whiskey to dull the pain, but it wasn't enough. Twice he passed out completely, and twice she thought she'd lost him, but finally, she got the arrow out. The wound bled freely for several minutes before she could get it under control, and she had to use nearly half her supply of clean bandages to bind both his shoulder and his leg. By the time she was finished, both of them were exhausted. Your sister, Addie said as she helped him drink some water. The men said someone bought her. Is that true? Kinpuash's eyes, clearer now that the arrow was out, blazed with anger. My sister Toby, she was gathering roots near the reservation. Boundary, white men took her, sold her to trader like horse. And you went to get her back. I went to buy her back. Brought furs, beadwork, everything I had. His voice was weak but steady. Trader laughed, said she was worth more than all my furs. Said she was his property now. Addie felt sick again. She'd heard stories like this before, but she'd always hoped they were exaggerated. So you fought them. I had no choice. They would not sell. They would not trade. They said she was theirs to do with as they pleased. Kinpuash's fist clenched despite his weakness. I could not leave my sister in that place. What about you? 3 men who died? 2 were trying to stop me from taking Toby. The third ... double quotes. Kinpuash looked away. The third was the one who had been ... using her. He tried to shoot me in the back as we rode away. Addie nodded, understanding now why the young warrior had been so desperate, why he'd risked everything to rescue his sister. Where is she now? Safe. I got her to our people before the posse caught my trail. A small smile crossed his face. She is with our grandmother now. That is why I could not let them catch me alive. If they took me, they might learn where she is. And now? Kinpuash was quiet for a long moment. Now I have brought danger to you. The white sheriff and his men, they will come back. And when they do not find me ... He looked at her with concern. They will know someone helped me. Let me worry about that, Addie said. But even as she spoke the words, she knew he was right. Sheriff Dalton wasn't stupid, and neither were his men. Sooner or later, they'd figure out that someone had helped the wounded warrior. And when they did, her life in this place would be over. But as she looked at Kinpuash, this young man who'd risked everything to save his sister from a fate worse than death, Addie knew she'd made the right choice. Some things were worth the risk. Some things were worth losing everything for. She just hoped she'd live long enough to see whether this was one of them. The candles burned low as Addie kept her vigil through the rest of the night, changing Kinpuash's bandages and forcing him to drink water whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and carrying with it the scent of rain. Dawn was still hours away, but Addie could feel it coming, and with it, whatever consequences her choice would bring, she'd sheltered a bleeding Modoc warrior from Sheriff Dalton's posse. She'd saved the life of a man who had killed 3 white men. And somewhere out in the darkness she knew, his people were already moving to find him. By morning, everything would change. The only question was whether she'd be alive to see it. Dawn came like a bleeding wound across the eastern sky, painting the Oregon high desert in shades of crimson and gold. Addie Weston had not slept. She sat in her wooden chair by the window, her Winchester rifle across her knees, watching the horizon for signs of movement. The coffee in her cup had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. Every shadow, every shifting sagebrush, every hawk circling overhead could be the harbinger of what was coming, and something was definitely coming. The signs had been there since before first light. A column of smoke rising from the hills to the north, too straight and controlled to be a wildfire. The distant sound of drums, so faint she might have imagined it if not for the way her horses kept shifting nervously in the corral. Most telling of all, the complete absence of wildlife. No rabbits darting between the brush, no ground squirrels chattering from their burrows, no birds singing their morning songs. The desert had gone silent, the way it always did when predators were near. In the cellar below, Kinpuwash stirred restlessly. His fever had broken near dawn, and with it had come a change in his demeanor. The grateful wounded young man had been replaced by something harder, more watchful. When Addie had brought him water and checked his bandages, she'd seen the way. His eyes tracked every sound, every creak of the floorboards above. He was listening for something specific, and from the set of his jaw, he expected to hear it soon. "They're coming, aren't they?" Addie had asked him as she rebandaged his shoulder. Wounded Kinpuwash had nodded grimly. "My uncle, Chief Hasanonda, he leads our war party. When a warrior does not return from battle, the family searches. How will they know to look here? They will follow the same trail the white lawman followed. Blood speaks loudly in the desert." Kinpuwash had gripped her wrist gently with his good hand. "You should go. Take your horse and ride to your town. Tell them you saw nothing. I'm not leaving you here to die. Better one should die than many." His dark eyes had been serious, older than his years. "If my people find you here, they will think you are my captor. If your people find me here, they will think you are my accomplice. Either way, blood will flow." But Addie had refused to leave. She'd made her choice the night before when she'd pulled him from the shadows of her woodshed. She would see it through whatever came. Now, as the sun climbed higher and the heat began to shimmer off the distant rocks, she was beginning to wonder if that choice had been the height of foolishness or the greatest act of courage in her life. Probably both. The first sign of their approach was a dust cloud on the northern horizon. Small at first, but growing steadily larger. Addie felt her mouth go dry as she counted the riders. 20, 30, 40. More than she could accurately number at this distance. They moved in perfect formation, not bunched together like a white posse, but spread out in a tactical pattern that spoke of military discipline and years of warfare. These were not reservation Indians riding to town to trade blankets and beadwork. These were warriors riding to war. As they drew closer, Addie could make out individual details that made her heart race even faster. War paint streaked across faces and horses alike. Feathered lances and tomahawks glinting in the morning sun. The riders themselves sat their horses with the easy grace of men who had been born in the saddle, their eyes scanning the terrain with the intensity of predators hunting prey. At the head of the column rode a man who could only be Chief Hasanonda. Even at a distance, his bearing commanded attention. He was older than the others, probably in his 50s, with silver threading through his long black hair. His war paint was more elaborate than the rest, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had led warriors through countless battles and brought most of them home alive. Behind him rode a younger man who bore such a strong resemblance to Kinpiwash that Addie knew he must be family. This one was larger than the wounded warrior in her cellar, broader through the shoulders and chest, and he carried a rifle with the casual competence of someone who had killed many times before. His face was set in lines of barely controlled fury, and even from a distance, Addie could see the hatred burning in his eyes. The war party stopped just outside rifle range of her cabin, their horses shifting and stamping in the morning heat. For several long minutes, nobody moved. They simply sat there, studying her property with the patient intensity of men who had all the time in the world. Addie could feel their eyes on her cabin, on her barn, on every possible hiding place where their missing warrior might be concealed. Finally, Chief Hasanonda urged his horse forward. He came alone, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons, but Addie wasn't fooled. She'd heard stories about Modoc warriors, about their skill with knives and tomahawks, about how they could kill a man with their bare hands faster than most men could draw a gun. This was not a gesture of peace so much as a display of confidence. He was showing her that he didn't need weapons to be dangerous. The chief stopped his horse 20 feet from her front porch, close enough to talk without shouting, but far enough away to avoid any sudden moves. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear and precise. "I am Hasanonda, war chief of the Modoc people. I seek my nephew Kinpiwash, son of my sister." Addie stood slowly, keeping her rifle lowered but ready. "I'm Adelaide Weston. This is my land. Your land sits on the blood trail of my nephew. He was wounded in battle with your lawmen. The trail leads here and stops." The chief's dark eyes never left her face. "Where is he?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Hasanonda's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them, a subtle increase in tension that made Addie's skin crawl. "You lie badly, woman. I can smell his blood on the wind. I can hear his pain in the silence of the desert creatures." He gestured toward the watching warriors behind him. "My men can smell it too. They grow restless." Addie glanced at the war party and saw that he was right. Several of the younger warriors had begun to edge their horses closer, their hands moving toward their weapons. The resemblance between one of them and Kinpiwash was even more pronounced up close, and the fury in his eyes was like looking into a forge fire. "That is Scarface Jack, another of my nephews," Hasanonda said, following her gaze. "He is less patient than I am. He believes you have taken his brother prisoner. He wishes to burn your dwelling and search the ashes for Kinpiwash's bones." "And what do you believe?" The chief studied her for a long moment, his weathered face giving nothing away. "I believe you saved his life. The blood trail shows he was dying when he reached your dwelling. If you had wished him harm, you would have let the desert claim him." He paused. "But I also believe you are afraid. And fear makes even good people do foolish things, such as trying to hold a Modoc warrior against his will, such as thinking you can trade his life for your safety." Hasanonda's voice grew harder. "Such as believing you can stand against 50 warriors with one rifle and expect to see another sunset." Addie felt sweat beading on her forehead, despite the morning chill. The chief was right, of course. She couldn't fight 50 warriors. She couldn't even fight 5. But she also couldn't just hand Kinpiwash over to them, not when she still didn't know their intentions. For all she knew, they might kill him themselves for the dishonor of being wounded and captured. "What would you do if I told you he was here?" she asked. "I would ask to see him. I would ask if he came willingly or by force. I would ask if he wishes to leave with us." Hasanonda's eyes narrowed slightly. "And then I would decide whether you live or die." The brutal honesty of the statement hit Addie like a physical blow. This was not a negotiation. This was not a discussion between equals. This was a war chief giving her one chance to do the right thing, before he took what he wanted by force. From somewhere behind the cabin came the sound of a door creaking open. Addie's heart sank as she realized that Kinpuash must have heard the voices and decided to emerge from his hiding place. She turned to see him walking slowly around the corner of the cabin, still pale and moving carefully to avoid reopening his wounds, but upright and alert. The reaction from the war party was immediate and electric. Several of the younger warriors let out whoops of joy and relief, while others began singing what sounded like a war song. But it was Scarface Jack's reaction that worried Addie the most. Instead of relief, his face showed only intensified rage as he took in his brother's bandaged wounds and weakened condition. Kinpuash, Hasanonda called out, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and stern authority. You live. I live, uncle. Kinpuash's voice was stronger than it had been in the cellar, though Addie could see the effort it cost him to project confidence. Thanks to this woman's kindness. Kindness? Scarface Jack's voice cut across the morning air like a blade. She has kept you prisoner. Used you as a shield against our vengeance. Brother, no. Kinpuash took a step forward, then had to catch himself against the cabin wall as dizziness overcame him. She saved my life. I would have died without her. Help. You should have died rather than accept help from our enemies. Jack's hand moved to the tomahawk at his belt. You have brought dishonor on our family. Enough. Hasanonda's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Kinpuash, come here. Tell me what happened. What followed was a rapid conversation. In the Modoc language, too fast and complex for Addie to follow, but she could read the body language well enough. Kinpuash was defending her actions while several of the other warriors, led by Scarface Jack, argued for what looked like immediate violence. Chief Hasanonda listened to all sides, his face grave and thoughtful. Finally, the chief held up a hand for silence. When he spoke again, it was in English, clearly intended for Addie to understand. My nephew tells me you found him dying in your yard. He tells me you hid him from the white lawmen at great risk to yourself. He tells me you removed an arrow from his shoulder and tended his wounds through the night. Hasanonda's eyes fixed on Addie's face. He also tells me you asked for nothing in return. Is this true? It's true. Why? It was the same question Kinpuash had asked her the night before, and Addie found herself giving the same answer. Because he needed help. Many people need help. You do not save them all. Addie struggled to put her feelings into words. How could she explain the complex mix of compassion, stubbornness, and simple human decency that had driven her to risk everything for a stranger? How could she make this war chief understand that sometimes the right thing to do was also the most dangerous thing to do? Your nephew risked his life to save his sister from men who would have used her badly, she said finally. That took courage. When I saw him bleeding in my yard, I saw that courage. I couldn't let it die. The chief's expression shifted slightly. And for the first time, Addie thought she saw something like approval in his eyes. You understand honor. I understand right and wrong. Sometimes they are the same thing. Hasanonda dismounted from his horse and walked closer to the cabin, stopping just a few feet from where Addie stood. But understanding honor and living by it are different things. You have done an honorable thing, Adelaide Weston, but you have also done a dangerous thing. Dangerous how? The white sheriff and his men, they will return. When they do not find Kinpuash's body, they will know someone helped him escape. They will come for you with rope and questions. The chief's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. They will not be gentle. Addie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She'd been so focused on the immediate danger of the war party that she hadn't fully considered the long-term consequences of her actions. Sheriff Dalton was not a man to let mysteries go unsolved, and Deputy Barnes had looked at her with suspicion, even before they'd searched her property. What are you saying? I am saying you cannot stay here. Your old life is over." Hasanonda gestured toward the assembled warriors. "But honor demands that we repay the debt we owe you. You saved the life of my nephew. Now we offer to save yours." "By doing what?" "By taking you with us. You have skills as a healer, skills our people need. You have shown courage and wisdom. You would be welcomed among the Modoc, treated with respect, and protected from your enemies." The offer hit Addie like a thunderbolt. Leave everything she'd ever known? Abandon her cabin, her land, her life as a white woman to go live among the very people most of her neighbors considered savage enemies. It was unthinkable. It was also, she realized, probably her only chance of survival. "And if I refuse?" Hasanonda's expression grew sad. "Then you will face the white man's justice alone. And we both know how merciful that justice can be toward those who help Indians." Addie looked around at her property, at the cabin she'd shared with her husband, at the land she'd worked so hard to make into a home. Then she looked at the assembled warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. Finally, she looked at Kinpuwash, who was watching her with an expression of deep concern. "I need time to think." "Time is what you do not have," Scarface Jack interjected, his voice harsh with impatience. "Even now, the white soldiers may be riding this way. Every moment we delay is a moment closer to discovery." "My brother speaks truth," Kinpuwash said, his voice gentle but urgent. "The army garrison at Fort Klamath is only a day's hard ride from here. If Sheriff Dalton sends word that a war party has been seen..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Addie could imagine the rest all too clearly. Cavalry troops thundering across the desert, artillery shells exploding among the rocks, the kind of wholesale slaughter that had marked every major confrontation between the army and the Indian tribes. "How long do I have to decide?" "Until the sun reaches its peak," Hasanonda said. "Then we must go, with or without you." Addie nodded, her mind reeling with the implications of the choice before her. Stay and face almost certain death at the hands of Sheriff Dalton's men, or flee into the wilderness with a band of Modoc warriors and abandon everything she'd ever known. Some choice. As she stood there in the growing heat of the morning sun, surrounded by painted warriors on horseback, Addie Weston realized that her old life had ended the moment she decided to help a wounded stranger. The only question now was whether her new life would begin in the Oregon wilderness or in a hangman's noose. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows grew shorter, and the moment of decision drew inexorably closer. The sun had climbed to its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the desert floor, when the dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon. Addie spotted it first, a thin brown line against the pale sky that spoke of riders coming hard and fast. Her stomach clenched as she counted the distant figures, at least 20 men, maybe more, riding in the tight formation favored by cavalry. "Units, Uncle," Kinpuwash called out, his voice carrying a note of urgency as he too spotted the approaching riders. "The blue soldiers come from Fort Klamath." Chief Hasanonda turned in his saddle, his weathered face grim as he studied the distant cavalry column. "How long?" 2 hours, maybe less if they push their horses." Kinpuwash struggled to his feet, favoring his wounded leg. "They will have howitzers, mountain guns, enough firepower to shell us from the ridges." The reaction among the Modoc warriors was immediate and electric. Weapons were checked, horses were gathered closer, and the easy confidence that had marked their arrival began to shift into the tense alertness of men preparing for battle. But it was Scarface Jack's response that worried Addie the most. Instead of fear or concern, his scarred features lit up with something that looked almost like joy. "Good," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "Let them come. We will paint the desert with their blood as we did at the lava beds." "There will be no battle here," Chief Hasanonda said firmly. "We did not come to fight the army. We came for our kinsmen." "Then we take him and go," Jack snapped back. Leave the white woman to face the soldiers' questions. She chose to help our enemy's enemy. Let her live with the consequences. She saved Kinpiwasha's life, another warrior interjected. This was an older man with gray streaking his braided hair and the kind of scars that spoke of many battles. Survived. Honor demands we offer her protection. Honor? Jack's voice dripped with contempt. Where was her honor when her people murdered our children at Bloody Point? Where was her honor when the army drove us from our ancestral lands into that desert wasteland they call a reservation? The argument might have continued, but Chief Hasanonda raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. We will not debate history while our enemies approach. Adelaide Weston, the time for your decision has come. Will you trust your fate to the white soldier's mercy, or will you ride with us? Addie looked from the approaching cavalry to the assembled Modoc warriors, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. If she stayed, she would have to explain to Colonel Wheaton why a Modoc war party had been at her cabin, why there was blood on her dress and medical supplies scattered through her cellar. The colonel was a reasonable man, but he was also under enormous pressure from Washington to prevent another Indian war in Oregon. He might decide that a dead witness was safer than a living one who might complicate his reports. But if she left with the Modocs, she would be abandoning everything she'd spent 5 years building. Her cabin, her medical practice, her carefully cultivated independence, all of it would be lost forever. More than that, she would be crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. In the eyes of white society, a woman who chose to live with Indians was no longer white at all. She would become something else entirely, something that existed in the dangerous space between two worlds. If I come with you, she said slowly, what exactly are you offering? What would my life be like among your people? Chief Hasanonda considered the question carefully before answering. You would be under my personal protection as long as you remain with us. You would be given a lodge of your own, hunting rights, and a voice in matters that concern the welfare of our people. Your skills as a healer would be valued and respected. He paused. But you would also be expected to contribute to our survival. These are hard times for the Modoc people. We have been pushed from our traditional lands, cheated by corrupt government agents, and hunted like animals by the army. We cannot afford to feed anyone who does not pull their own weight. And if I prove unable to adapt, if I cannot learn your ways or contribute meaningfully to your survival, the chief's expression grew somber. Then you would be free to leave, though I would not be able to guarantee your safe passage back to white civilization. The frontier is a dangerous place for a woman traveling alone. Addie nodded, understanding the unspoken implications. This was not just a temporary refuge being offered. It was a complete transformation of identity. If she rode away with these warriors, Adelaide Weston the frontier healer would cease to exist. In her place would be someone new, someone who belonged fully to neither world but existed in the margins between them. The approaching cavalry was close enough now that she could make out individual details. Blue uniforms, military saddles, the glint of sabers and rifle barrels. At the head of the column rode a figure she recognized, Lieutenant Morrison, Colonel Wheaton's aide-de-camp and the kind of by-the-book officer who saw every situation in terms of regulations and military protocol. If Morrison was leading this patrol, it meant the colonel was taking the Modoc presence very seriously indeed. They're not coming to talk, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. No, Chief Hasanonda agreed. They are coming to fight. Or to arrest. Either way, anyone found here will be considered hostile. Addie closed her eyes and tried to imagine the conversation that would follow if she stayed. Morrison demanding to know why she'd been harboring a fugitive. Her attempts to explain about medical ethics and humanitarian obligations. The lieutenant's growing suspicion as he noted the evidence of her deception. And finally, the inevitable conclusion that she was either a traitor or a fool, neither of which would end well for her. When she opened her eyes, she found Kinpuash watching her with an expression of deep concern. Despite his wounds and the dangers surrounding them all, he seemed more worried about her choice than about his own survival. "I will not think less of you if you stay," he said quietly. "You have already risked more for me than I had any right to ask. And I will not think less of you if you come," Chief Hasanonda added. "There is no shame in choosing survival over principle when the two cannot coexist." But it was Scar-Faced Jack's words that decided her. "Choose quickly, white woman. My patience grows thin, and my horse grows restless. We have wasted enough time on your conscience." The contempt in his voice, the casual dismissal of her struggle, reminded Addie of every man who had ever told her that her thoughts and feelings didn't matter. It reminded her of the townspeople who whispered that a woman had no business practicing medicine, of the officials who insisted she needed a male guardian to own property, of the countless small indignities and large injustices that had shaped her life as a woman on the frontier. She was tired of being told what she could and couldn't do. Tired of having her choices dictated by other people's fears and prejudices. Tired of living her life in the narrow spaces that society deemed appropriate for women like her. "I'll need to gather some supplies," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Chief Hasanonda's eyebrows rose slightly. "You will come with us?" "I will come with you." The words felt strange in her mouth, as if she were hearing someone else speak them. "But I need medicine, clothes, tools, things that will make me useful to your people. You have 10 minutes, the chief said. "Take only what you can carry on horseback." Addie nodded and hurried into her cabin, her mind racing as she tried to decide what to take and what to leave behind. Her medical supplies were the obvious priority: bandages, laudanum, surgical instruments, the various herbs and tinctures she'd spent years collecting and preparing. She stuffed them into her largest saddlebags, along with extra clothes and her most precious personal possessions: her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, and the daguerreotype of her and Thomas on their wedding day. Everything else would have to stay. The furniture Thomas had built with his own hands, the books she'd collected over the years, the small treasures and keepsakes that had made this place feel like home. She moved through the cabin like a woman in a dream, touching familiar objects one last time before leaving them forever. In the bedroom, she changed from her blood-stained dress into riding clothes, sturdy pants, a cotton shirt, and boots, designed for hard travel. She strapped on her gun belt and checked the loads in her Navy Colt, then grabbed her Winchester rifle and a box of ammunition. If she was going to live in the wilderness, she would need to be able to defend herself. The hardest moment came when she stood in the doorway, looking back at the life she was abandoning. 5 years of memories filled this small space. 5 years of slowly learning to live alone, to be strong, to find peace in solitude. Now she was trading that hard-won independence for an uncertain future among people she barely understood. But as she looked around the cabin one last time, Addie realized that she wasn't really giving up her independence. She was choosing a different kind of freedom, the freedom to be judged by her actions rather than her gender, the freedom to live according to her own moral code rather than society's expectations. It was a terrifying kind of freedom, but it was hers to choose. When she emerged from the cabin, she found the Modoc warriors mounted and ready to ride. Chief Hasanonda had prepared her horse, a sturdy gray mare that looked capable of handling rough country. Kinpuash sat his own mount with obvious discomfort, his face pale with pain, but his eyes bright with determination. "The soldiers?" Addie asked as she swung into the saddle. "Close enough to see our dust when we leave," Hasanonda replied. "But we know paths through the lava beds that their horses cannot follow. We will be ghosts before they reach this place." As they prepared to ride out, Scar-Faced Jack maneuvered his horse close to Addie's. His scarred face was set in hard lines, and when he spoke, his voice was cold as winter wind. Understand this, white woman. You may ride with us, but you are not one of us. You have not earned your place through blood and suffering as we have. If you slow us down, if you betray us, if you prove to be more burden than benefit, I will leave you for the buzzards without a second thought. Jack, Kinpuwash warned, his voice sharp. No, brother, she needs to hear this. Jack's eyes never left Addie's face. Our people are dying, starving on the reservation, hunted like animals when we try to live free. We cannot afford your white woman sentimentality. We cannot afford weakness. Addie met his gaze steadily. I don't expect special treatment because I'm a woman or because I'm white. I expect to pull my own weight and prove my worth through my actions. But I also expect to be treated with the same respect you'd show any other member of your band. Jack's laugh was harsh and bitter. Respect is earned, not given. You want my respect? Then survive what's coming. Help us stay alive when the whole world wants us dead. Do that, and maybe, I'll stop seeing you as just another white face that reminds me of everything my people have lost. Before Addie could respond, Chief Hasanonda whistled sharply. The war party began to move, horses stepping carefully through the sagebrush as they angled toward the distant hills. Addie took one last look at her cabin, at the life she was leaving behind, then urged her mare forward. They rode in single file through terrain that would have challenged an experienced cavalry unit. The Modoc warriors moved through the landscape like water flowing around obstacles, their horses picking their way across rocky ground and through narrow defiles with the sure-footed confidence of animals that had been bred for this kind of country. Addie did her best to keep up, grateful for the years she'd spent exploring the high desert on horseback. Behind them, she could see the dust cloud of the approaching cavalry growing larger. Lieutenant Morrison was pushing his men hard, probably hoping to catch the war party in open ground where his superior numbers and firepower would give him a decisive advantage. But the Modocs had no intention of fighting on the army's terms. As they climbed into the foothills, the terrain became even more challenging. Ancient lava flows had created a landscape of twisted rock formations, deep crevices, and hidden passages that offered perfect cover for anyone who knew how to use them. The Modoc warriors seemed to know every stone, every shadow, every secret path through this volcanic maze. Your people call this the Devil's Garden, Kinpuwash said, pulling his horse alongside Addie's as they paused to rest the animals. To us it is simply home. The place where our ancestors learned to survive when the earth itself tried to kill them. Addie looked around at the harsh beauty of the lava beds, at the twisted rock formations that looked like the bones of some ancient beast. It was a landscape that demanded respect, that punished the careless and rewarded those who understood its moods and dangers. How do you navigate through all this without getting lost? The same way your people navigate the streets of your cities, Kinpuwash replied with a slight smile. Practice, knowledge passed down from parent to child, and respect for the land that shelters us. From somewhere behind them came the distant sound of horses and men's voices. The cavalry had reached her cabin and discovered their quarry gone. Lieutenant Morrison would be furious at losing the trail, but he wouldn't give up easily. He would send scouts to search for tracks, set up a perimeter to prevent escape, and probably call for reinforcements from Fort Klamath. Will they follow us into the lava beds? Addie asked. Chief Hasanonda, who had been listening to their conversation, shook his head grimly. They have tried before. Always with the same result, dead soldiers and empty saddles. The lava beds do not forgive mistakes, and white soldiers make many mistakes. As they continued deeper into the volcanic wasteland, Addie began to understand what he meant. This was not country for large military units with their supply wagons and artillery pieces. This was guerrilla country, perfect for small bands of Warriors who could live off the land and disappear into the rock formations like smoke in the wind. But it was also country that would test her own survival skills to their limits. The desert heat was already making her clothes stick to her skin, and they'd barely begun their journey. Water would be scarce, food scarcer still, and every day would bring new challenges that could mean the difference between life and death. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the lava beds in shades of red and gold, Addie realized that her old life hadn't just ended. It had been transformed into something entirely new. She was no longer Adelaide Weston, frontier healer and independent woman. She was now Adelaide Weston, fugitive from white justice and reluctant member of a Modoc war band. The question was whether she would survive long enough to figure out what that meant. The war party continued its trek through the twisted landscape, leaving behind a dust cloud that spoke of urgent flight and uncertain destiny. Somewhere behind them, the cavalry was regrouping and planning pursuit. Somewhere ahead lay either sanctuary or death. Addie gripped her reins tighter and rode toward whatever fate awaited her in the heart of the Devil's Garden. 3 days into the lava beds, Addie learned that survival was measured not in grand gestures, but in small, brutal truths. The volcanic wasteland stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of razor-sharp obsidian and porous rock that cut through boot leather and shredded clothing with casual indifference. The water they carried was already running low, rationed to mere sips that barely wet the throat, and the relentless sun turned the black rock into a furnace that baked the strength from man and beast alike. She had thought she understood hardship. 5 years of frontier life had taught her to endure discomfort, to make do with little, to find strength when weakness seemed easier. But this was different. This was not the familiar hardship of a difficult winter or a poor harvest. This was nature stripped of all mercy, testing every decision against the absolute standard of life or death. The Modoc warriors moved through this hellscape with the fluid grace of men born to it, but even they showed the strain. Horses stumbled on the treacherous footing, their hooves cracking against stone that seemed designed to cripple anything that dared cross it. The youngest warriors, barely out of boyhood, pressed their lips tight against complaints that would have brought shame to their families. Even Chief Hasanonda's weathered features showed the deep lines of a man carrying the weight of many lives on his shoulders. But it was Kinpuash who worried Addie the most. His wounds, which had seemed to be healing well in the safety of her cabin, had begun to fester in the heat and dust of the trail. The arrow wound in his shoulder wept a thin, foul-smelling discharge that spoke of infection taking hold, and his leg wound had started bleeding again despite her careful binding. Each day he grew a little paler, a little weaker, though he hid it well behind the stoic mask that seemed to be the birthright of Modoc men. On the morning of the 4th day, as they sheltered in the shade of a towering rock formation that offered brief respite from the sun, Addie finally forced the issue. "I need to examine your wounds properly," she told Kinpuash, pulling her medical supplies from her saddlebags. "The infection is spreading. If we don't deal with it now, you could lose the arm." Kinpuash started to protest, but Chief Hasanonda cut him off with a sharp gesture. "The healer speaks wisdom. Remove your shirt." When Kinpuash reluctantly complied, Addie had to bite back a gasp of dismay. The infection was worse than she'd feared. Red streaks radiated from the wound site like poisonous lightning, and the flesh around the arrow puncture was hot and swollen. She'd seen gangrene before, knew the telltale signs of blood poisoning that could kill a strong man in days. "This is bad," she said, not bothering to soften the truth. "The wound needs to be opened, cleaned, and cauterized. It's going to hurt like hell, and there's no guarantee it will work." "Do what you must," Kinpuash said, his voice steady despite the pain she could see in his eyes. What followed was a nightmare of blood and screaming that echoed off the canyon walls like the cries of the damned. Addie had to cut deep into infected tissue, scraping away the putrid flesh with her sharpest knife, while Kinpuash writhed in agony. 2 warriors held him down while she worked, their faces grim with the knowledge that they might be watching their kinsman die. The cauterization was worse. Addie heated her knife blade in a small fire until it glowed cherry red, then pressed it against the open wound. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, and Kinpuash's scream rose to a pitch that seemed to split the very rocks around them. But when it was over, the bleeding had stopped and the infection looked cleaner. "He needs rest," Addie said, washing her hands with precious water from their dwindling supply. "Real rest, not this constant riding. And he needs better food than what we're carrying." "Rest is a luxury we cannot afford," Chief Hasanonda replied, though his eyes showed concern for his nephew. "The army patrols grow bolder each day. They have brought in Apache scouts from Arizona, men who can track a shadow across solid rock. If we stay in one place too long, they will find us." As if summoned by his words, one of the sentries came scrambling down from his perch on the canyon. Rim. It was a young warrior named Blue Hawk, barely 18, but already marked by the hard wisdom that came with living as a hunted man. "Soldiers," he reported breathlessly. "2 companies, maybe more. They're spread out in a line, searching every cave and crevice. They have the Apache with them. I could see their scouts' reading sign on the far ridge." The reaction was immediate. Warriors began checking weapons and preparing to move, their movements quick and efficient despite the oppressive heat. But Addie could see the exhaustion in their faces, the way their hands shook slightly as they worked. They were being pushed to their limits and everyone knew it. "How far?" Chief Hasanonda asked. 6 miles, maybe 7. "But they're moving fast, and they know this country better than I expected." Blue Hawk's young face was tight with worry. "The Apache, they're reading our trail like a book. They know exactly where we've been and where we're going." Scar-faced Jack spat into the dust, his scarred features twisted with rage. "Apache dogs. They sell their souls to the white man for 30 pieces of silver, just like in the missionaries. Book, they do what they must to survive," Chief Hasanonda said quietly. "As do we all. Survival?" Jack's voice rose dangerously. "We're not surviving, Uncle. We're slowly dying, running like rabbits from every shadow. And for what? To drag this white woman through the desert until she gets us all killed." Every eye turned to Addie, and she felt the weight of their collective judgment like a physical thing. She'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when her presence would be seen as more liability than asset. The question was whether she'd proven herself valuable enough to survive it. "The woman has skills we need," Chief Hasanonda sighed, but his voice lacked conviction. "She saved Kinpuash's life. And now Kinpuash slows us down because of wounds that should have healed days ago," Jack countered. "She's a white woman trying to play Indian, and she's going to get us all scalped for her trouble." "I can keep up," Addie said, finding her voice despite the fear that threatened to choke her. "I haven't slowed you down yet." "Yet," Jack repeated, the word dripping with contempt. "But the real test is coming. When the bullets start flying, when men are dying, when you have to choose between your white conscience and Modoc survival, what then, healer woman? What then?" Before Addie could answer, another commotion erupted from the canyon rim. This time it was Gray Wolf, the oldest of the scouts, sliding down the rocky slope with the desperate haste of a man bringing terrible news. "They found the water hole at Scorpion Springs," he gasped, fighting to catch his breath. "The Apache led them right to it. They're setting up an ambush, rifles, maybe a mountain howitzer. Anyone who tries to water there will be cut to pieces." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Scorpion Springs was the only reliable water source within 2 days' ride. Without it, they would have to either find another route through even more desolate country or risk everything on a direct assault against superior numbers and firepower. "There's another spring," Chief Hasanonda said slowly, his voice heavy with reluctance. Crying woman falls in the heart of the Forbidden's Valley, but the spirits there are angry. The water is cursed. Cursed how? Addie asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to hear the answer. It was Kinpuwash who replied, his voice weak but steady. 2 years ago, during the first rebellion, a band of our warriors took refuge there. They drank the water, filled their bellies, felt strong again. He paused, his face grim with memory. Within hours, they were all dead. Not from bullets or disease, but from the water itself. It burns like liquid fire, turns the stomach inside out, makes men beg for death. Alkali poisoning, Addie said, understanding immediately. The water's contaminated with mineral salts. Enough to kill a horse, let alone a man. You know of this curse? Grey Wolf asked, his weathered features showing surprise. It's not a curse. It's chemistry, the water's undrinkable, but... Addie paused, her mind racing through possibilities. But if we could distill it, remove the minerals, there might be a way. Chief Hasanonda's eyes sharpened with interest. Explain. We'd need to build a still. Boil the water, capture the steam, let it condense back into pure water. It's not complicated, but it takes time and fuel. Addie looked around at the barren landscape. And we'd need something to burn. The old cedar grove, Blue Hawk said suddenly. In the hidden canyon below Crying Woman Falls, the trees are dead now, killed by the same minerals that poison the water, but they're still standing. Dry as bone and ready to burn. For the first time in days, Chief Hasanonda smiled. You begin to earn your place among us, white woman. But this plan requires that we reach the Forbidden's Valley alive, and the Apache are still reading our trail. Like smoke signals. Then we give them something else to read, Scarface Jack said, and there was something in his voice that made Addie's blood run cold. We split the group. Half continue north towards Scorpion Springs, making enough sign to keep the Apache busy. The other half circles wide to the Forbidden's Valley. A diversion, Chief Hasanonda mused. Dangerous, but it might work. I'll lead. The diversion, Jack continued, his scarred face set in hard lines. Take 12 warriors, enough to make a convincing trail, but small enough to move fast. We'll lead them on a chase through Hell's Kitchen, maybe double back and hit their supply train if the opportunity presents itself. And if you're trapped? Jack's smile was cold as winter wind. Then we'll take as many of them with us as we can. The Apache will learn that betraying the Modoc comes with a price. The plan was desperate, but it was also their best chance of survival. As the warriors divided themselves into 2 groups, Addie found herself assigned to the smaller party, heading for the Forbidden's Valley. She wasn't sure if this was an honor or a death sentence, but either way, she was committed now. As they prepared to separate, Scarface Jack approached her one final time. His scarred features were unreadable, but when he spoke, his voice carried a grudging respect that hadn't been there before. You surprise me, white woman. I expected you to break by now, to beg us to take you back to your own people. He paused, studying her face. Instead, you offer solutions to problems that would stump most warriors. Perhaps there is more to you than I thought. Does that mean I've earned your respect? Jack's laugh was harsh but not entirely without humor. Respect is still earned with blood, not clever ideas. But you've earned the right to try. He swung into his saddle, his movements fluid despite his obvious exhaustion. Don't disappoint me, healer woman. And don't get my nephew killed with your white woman softness. As the 2 groups prepared to part ways, Kinpuwash gripped Addie's hand with his good arm. His face was still pale from the morning's ordeal, but his eyes were clear and determined. My brother is wrong about one thing, he said quietly. You've already proven yourself with more than blood. You've proven yourself with courage, with wisdom, with the kind of strength that doesn't come from weapons. He squeezed her hand gently. Whatever happens in the Forbidden's Valley, I am honored to have you as my battle sister. The words hit Addie like a physical blow. Battle sister. In the space of 4 days, she'd gone from being a frontier healer to being claimed as family by a Modoc warrior. The transformation was so complete, so unexpected, that she barely recognized herself. As Jack's diversionary force rode north toward their dangerous rendezvous with the cavalry, Addie's group turned west toward the Forbidden Valley and its poisoned springs. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the lava beds in shades of red and gold that reminded her of blood and fire. Behind them, the dust clouds of their enemies drew steadily closer. Ahead lay a valley where the very water could kill, where ancient spirits were said to guard secrets older than memory. And somewhere between those two poles of danger, Addie realized, lay her destiny. She was no longer running from her old life. She was running toward something entirely new, something that would test every skill she possessed and demand more courage than she'd ever needed before. The frontier healer who had pulled a wounded warrior from the shadows of her woodshed was gone forever. In her place rode a woman who belonged fully to neither world, but had found her own place in the space between them. A woman who had chosen survival over safety, unknown dangers over familiar ones, and the wild freedom of the outlaw trail over the constrained respectability of civilized society. The Forbidden Valley awaited, with its poisoned springs and angry spirits, but Addie Weston, battle sister to the Modoc, rode toward it without fear. She had already survived the greatest transformation of all, the death of who she used to be and the birth of who she was meant to become. The Forbidden Valley opened before them like a wound in the earth, its steep walls carved from black volcanic stone that seemed to swallow light itself. Crying Woman Falls plunged 200 feet down the far cliff face, the water catching what little sunlight penetrated the canyon depths and throwing it back in fractured rainbows that danced like ghost lights in the perpetual mist. But there was something wrong with the beauty of it, something that made the horses shy and roll their eyes in terror despite their exhaustion. The smell hit them first, a sharp, acrid stench that burned the nostrils and made breathing painful. It was the smell of minerals leaching from poisoned stone, of water that had been transformed into something deadly by its long journey through the corrupted heart of the earth. Even from the canyon rim, Addie could see the telltale white deposits that marked the edges of the poisoned pools below, mineral crusts that looked like the bones of some ancient creature scattered across the valley floor. The spirits are restless today, murmured White Crow, the medicine man who had joined their group when they split from Jack's diversion force. He was an elderly man with deep-set eyes that seemed to see things others missed, and his voice carried the weight of old wisdom and older fears. They know we come seeking what should not be taken. Chief Hasanonda studied the valley with the calculating gaze of a military commander, but Addie could see the unease in his weathered features. This was a place that challenged even Modoc courage, a place where the natural world had turned hostile in ways that weapons could not address. The Cedar Grove? He asked Blue Hawk, who had scouted ahead while the others rested. Still there, but ... The young warrior's voice trailed off uncertainly. The trees are not as I remembered them. They stand like sentinels, white as bleached bones, and they do not move even when the wind blows. It is as if they guard something that should remain hidden. Kinpuash, who had been growing stronger since Addie's brutal surgery, but still favored his wounded shoulder, studied the descent route with professional interest. The path down is treacherous, loose stone, narrow ledges. If we're trapped down there, we won't be trapped, Addie said with more confidence than she felt. We get down, build the still, purify enough water to fill our containers, and get out. Simple. Nothing is simple in the Forbidden Valley, White Crow said, his voice heavy with foreboding. The spirits that dwell here have been angry since the earth first split and the poisoned water began to flow. They do not welcome visitors, especially those who come to steal what they guard. We're not stealing, Addie replied, checking her. medical supplies and the makeshift distillation equipment she'd cobbled together from cooking pots and copper tubing were purifying poison into something life-giving. If anything, we're healing this place. The medicine man's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. You speak as if you understand the spirits, white woman. But understanding and wisdom are not the same thing. The spirits care nothing for your good intentions. As they began the perilous descent into the valley, Addie couldn't shake the feeling that White Crow was right. There was something fundamentally wrong with this place, something that went beyond mere chemical contamination. The very air seemed thick with malevolence, and shadows moved in ways that defied the angle of the sun. Twice she could have sworn she heard voices whispering in languages she didn't recognize, though when she turned to look, there was nothing but empty stone and drifting mist. The path down was a nightmare of loose scree and crumbling ledges that threatened to give way under the weight of horse and rider. They had to dismount and lead their animals, testing each step carefully before committing their full weight. One of the pack horses slipped halfway down, sliding 20 feet before managing to regain its footing, and the sound of its frightened whinnying echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of a lost soul. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun had disappeared behind the western rim, plunging them into a twilight world of mist and shadows. The cedar grove stood before them, exactly as Blue Hawk had described, a forest of dead trees that had been bleached white by the mineral-rich air, their bare branches reaching toward the darkening sky like the arms of supplicants frozen in prayer. "We'll make camp here," Chief Hasanonda decided, gesturing toward a relatively flat area near the edge of the grove. "Build the fires, set up the distillation apparatus. If we work through the night, we can be out of here by dawn." The warriors moved with practiced efficiency despite their obvious unease, gathering the bone-dry cedar wood and arranging it into careful stacks. But Addie noticed that none of them would venture far into the grove itself, and more than once she caught them making what looked like protective gestures when they thought no one was looking. The wood burned with an eerie blue-green flame that cast strange shadows across the canyon walls. The smoke that rose from it was thick and acrid, adding its own contribution to the already poisonous atmosphere of the valley. But it burned hot and clean, exactly what they needed for the distillation process. Setting up the still proved more challenging than Addie had anticipated. The copper tubing she'd brought wasn't long enough to create the cooling coils she needed, and the makeshift collection vessels kept tipping over on the uneven ground. Kint Puwash helped as much as his wounded shoulder would allow, but it was clear that the work was taking its toll on him. His face was pale with exhaustion, and she could see the pain lines around his eyes growing deeper as the night wore on. "You should rest," she told him as they struggled to seal a connection that kept leaking precious steam. "I can finish this." "You cannot do this alone," he replied, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. "And I will not have it said that Kimpiwash let a woman do his work while he lay by the fire like an old dog." It was nearly midnight before they had the apparatus working properly. The poisoned water from Crying Woman Falls went into the heating vessel where it boiled into steam that traveled through the copper coils and condensed back into pure water that dripped slowly into their collection containers. The process was maddeningly slow, barely a trickle of purified water for all their effort, but it was working. That's when the voices started. At first, Addie thought it was just the wind moving through the dead cedar branches, creating the kind of moaning sounds that empty places sometimes make. But as she listened more carefully, she began to pick out what sounded like words, though in no language she recognized. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the canyon walls and rising from the mist that perpetually shrouded the poisoned pools. The Modoc warriors heard them too. She could see it in the way they checked their weapons and moved closer to the fires, in the way their eyes darted nervously toward the darker corners of the valley. Even Chief Hasanonda, who had faced cavalry charges and artillery bombardments without flinching, looked troubled by the supernatural atmosphere of the place. It was White Crow who finally gave voice to what they were all thinking. The spirits grow angry. They do not want us here. Spirits don't exist, Addie said, though her voice lacked conviction. It's just the wind, maybe gases escaping from the rock formations. Natural phenomena that seem supernatural because we don't understand them. Your understanding means nothing to the dead, the medicine man replied, his weathered face grim in the firelight. This valley has seen much death, much suffering. The spirits of those who died here do not rest easily. As if summoned by his words, a new sound joined the chorus of voices, a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It was barely audible at first, more felt than heard, but it grew steadily stronger until it seemed to pulse in rhythm with Addie's own heartbeat. "What is that?" she whispered, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "The death drums," White Crow said simply. "They beat for those who are about to join the spirits in their eternal dance." The horses began to panic, pulling at their tethers and rolling their eyes in terror. One of them, a normally steady gelding that had carried them through countless miles of desert, broke free and bolted toward the valley entrance, disappearing into the mist-shrouded darkness with the sound of its hoofbeats echoing off the stone walls. "We need to leave," Blue Hawk said, his young voice tight with fear. "Now, before the spirits trap us here forever." "We can't leave," Addie replied, gesturing toward the distillation apparatus. "We need more water. What we have isn't enough for the journey out of the lava beds. Better to die of thirst in the clean desert than to be claimed by angry spirits," one of the other warriors muttered, and several of his companions nodded agreement. But it was Kinpuash who settled the matter. Despite his wounds and obvious exhaustion, he rose to his feet and faced his fellow warriors with quiet dignity. "I will not run from shadows and superstition. This woman has risked everything to help our people. She has proven herself in blood and courage. If she says we need more water, then we stay until we have it." "Even if it costs our lives?" Blue Hawk asked. "Even then?" A warrior does not abandon his battle sister because frightened children hear ghosts in the wind. The rebuke stung, and Addie could see its effect on the younger warriors. None of them wanted to be seen as cowardly, especially not by a wounded hero who was willing to face supernatural terror for the sake of duty. Reluctantly, they settled back around the fires and tried to ignore the growing chorus of voices that filled the valley with their otherworldly lamentations. The distillation process continued through the night, drop by precious drop. Addie tended the apparatus with single-minded determination, adjusting the heat, monitoring the steam flow, and replacing the collection vessels as they filled with purified water. The work kept her hands busy and her mind focused, providing a welcome distraction from the increasingly disturbing phenomena around them, but she couldn't ignore what was happening to the valley itself. The mist from the falls seemed to be taking shape, forming vague humanoid figures that danced at the edge of vision before dissolving back into formless vapor. The temperature had dropped dramatically, turning their breath into visible puffs. Despite the heat from the fires, and the voices were growing clearer, more distinct, as if the speakers were drawing closer with each passing hour. It was around 3 in the morning, when things took a turn for the worse. White Crow, who had been sitting in meditation near the largest fire, suddenly cried out and pointed toward the cedar grove. Following his gaze, Addie saw what looked like lights moving among the dead trees, not the steady glow of fire, but something cold and blue that pulsed with its own alien rhythm. "The spirit lights," the medicine man whispered. "They come to claim the living." The lights began to move closer, weaving between the bleached trunks of the dead cedars like dancers following some ancient choreography. As they drew nearer, Addie could see that they weren't lights at all, but figures, translucent, shimmering beings that seemed to be made of the same mist that rose from the poisoned waters. "Nobody move," Chief Hasanoda commanded, his voice steady despite the supernatural terror surrounding them. "Stay by the fires. Do not look directly at them." But Addie couldn't help herself. As the spirit figures drew closer, she found herself staring into faces that were human but not human, familiar but utterly alien. They were the faces of the dead, she realized, not just the Modoc warriors who had died drinking the poisoned water, but others as well. Pioneers who had tried to cross the valley and never made it out. Soldiers who had pursued Indian raiders into this cursed place and paid the ultimate price for their ambition. One of the figures separated itself from the others and drifted closer to where Addie knelt beside the distillation apparatus. As it approached, she could make out more details: the uniform of a cavalry officer, the insignia of a lieutenant, the pale, accusatory eyes of a man who had died far from home in a place that offered no mercy to the living. The spirit lieutenant opened his mouth to speak, and his voice was the sound of wind through empty bones. "You do not belong here. Neither do you," Addie found herself replying, though her voice was barely a whisper. "You're dead. This isn't your place anymore." The spirit's expression shifted, becoming almost puzzled. "Dead. Yes. But not gone. Never. Gone. From this place." More figures were gathering now, forming a circle around their small camp. Addie could see warriors and soldiers, settlers and miners, men and women and children who had all met their end in this valley of poison and despair. They all shared the same hollow, hungry expression, the same desperate need that seemed to emanate from them like heat from a forge. "What do you want?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Life. Double quotes," the spirit lieutenant whispered, "the warmth of living blood. The breath of living lungs. What we lost. What we need." They were vampiric spirits, Addie realized, not the blood-drinking monsters of Gothic novels. Something far more fundamental. They were the essence of those who had died violent deaths, anchored to this place by their own anguish and unable to move on to whatever came next. They fed on the life force of the living, drawing sustenance from the very thing they could never possess again. The circle of spirits began to tighten, their translucent forms growing more solid as they drew closer to the warmth of living bodies. Addie could feel the temperature dropping even further, could see frost beginning to form on the metal parts of her distillation apparatus despite the heat from the fires. That's when she noticed something that changed everything. The purified water dripping from her makeshift still was glowing with a soft, steady light that had nothing to do with reflection from the fires. As each drop fell into the collection vessel, it seemed to push back the darkness, creating a small pool of illumination that the spirits couldn't approach. "The pure water," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. "It's not just purified, it's blessed, cleansed of the corruption that created this place." Without hesitation, she grabbed one of the collection vessels and splashed its contents in a wide arc around their camp. Where the purified water touched the ground, the spirits recoiled as if burned, their forms wavering and becoming less substantial. "More water," she shouted to Kinpuash. "We need more of the purified water." Working frantically, they began converting their entire supply of poisoned spring water into its purified form, not stopping to collect it for drinking, but using it as a weapon against the supernatural forces that threatened to overwhelm them. Each splash of clean water drove the spirits back a little further, each drop seeming to carry the power to cleanse not just minerals, but malevolence itself. The battle continued until dawn, when the first rays of sunlight penetrated the canyon depths and the spirits finally faded back into the mist from which they had emerged. Exhausted but alive, the survivors gathered what purified water they could carry and began the treacherous climb out of the Forbidden's Valley. As they reached the canyon rim and looked back at the cursed place they were leaving behind, Addie realized that she had crossed another threshold in her transformation from civilized woman to something else entirely. She had faced not just the physical dangers of the frontier, but the supernatural terrors that lurked in the spaces between worlds, and she had won. The smoke rising from Hell's Kitchen could be seen for miles across the lava beds, a black column against the morning sky like a monument to violence. As Addie and the survivors crested the ridge overlooking the battlefield, the carnage below became sickeningly clear. Bodies lay scattered across the volcanic stone, cavalry soldiers, Apache scouts, and Modoc warriors who had died with weapons. In their hands, Chief Hasanonda's weathered face showed no emotion as he surveyed the scene, but Addie could see the pain in his dark eyes. Each fallen warrior represented not just a loss to their fighting strength, but the death of a son, a brother, a keeper of their people's traditions. Scarface Jack? Kim Piwash asked, his voice hoarse with dread. They found Jack propped against a boulder, his shirt soaked with blood from multiple wounds, his rifle empty but still clutched in his hands. Around him lay the bodies of 4 cavalry soldiers and 2 Apache scouts, testament to the fury with which he had fought even while dying. When he saw them approaching, Jack's lips curved in a grim smile. Uncle ... You returned from the spirit realm. Good. I was beginning to think the cursed valley had claimed you. The valley tried, Chief Hasanonda said, kneeling beside his wounded nephew. But we had a powerful medicine woman to guide us through the darkness. Jack's eyes found Addie's face, and she saw something she'd never seen before, genuine respect mixed with fierce approval. So the white woman proved herself after all. I should have known better than to doubt a healer who could face down angry spirits. Don't talk, Addie said, already assessing his wounds. Save your strength. But Jack shook his head, blood flecking his lips. No healer woman. My time has come. I can feel the cold creeping up from my feet. His eyes found Kinpuwash. Your woman has spirit sight. She sees what others cannot. Trust her, brother. She will keep you alive when death comes calling. Before anyone could respond, Jack's head fell back against the stone, and the light faded from his eyes. The warrior who had questioned Addie's worth had spent his last breath defending her place among them. The burial was simple, as befitted warriors who had died far from home. They placed Jack's body in a shallow cave with his weapons, then sealed it with stones. White Crow spoke the traditional words while the others stood in respectful silence. But there was no time for extended mourning. Blue Hawk was reporting fresh signs of pursuit. The main cavalry force was regrouping, bringing reinforcements from 3 different posts. Artillery was being moved into position, and additional Apache scouts were arriving daily. We cannot fight them, Chief Hasanonda said as they held council. Not here, not with so few warriors left. We must retreat to the stronghold. The stronghold won't hold against howitzers, Kinpuwash pointed out. They'll stand off and pound you as to rubble. It was Addie who answered. We surrender. The silence that followed was complete. Every eye fixed on her face, reading shock, anger, and disbelief in their expressions. Surrender? White Crow's voice was heavy with disgust. You would have us crawl like beaten dogs? I would have you live, Addie replied firmly. All of you. Your children, your elders, your future generations. What good is dying gloriously if it means the end of your people? There is no honor in surrender, Blue Hawk said, his young voice tight with certainty. Better to die as warriors than live as slaves. Is there honor in extinction? Addie shot back. Is there honor in letting your culture die just to satisfy your pride? Chief Hasanonda held up a hand for silence. Speak your mind, medicine woman. Tell us what you see that we do not. Addie took a deep breath. I've lived in both worlds. I know how white politicians think, how the army operates. Right now, you're seen as dangerous renegades. But if you surrender voluntarily, you become something different in their eyes. a problem solved rather than a threat to be eliminated. And what of justice? White Crow demanded. What of the wrongs done to our people? Justice is a luxury. You can't afford right now, Addie said bluntly. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. Sometimes survival is more important than justice. The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling as warriors struggled with the terrible choice. Some argued for fighting to the death. Others spoke of their families, their children who would never grow up if the war continued. Chief Hasanonda finally ended the discussion. I have listened to all voices. Now I will speak as your chief. He looked at each warrior in turn. We will surrender, but not unconditionally. We will negotiate terms that preserve our dignity and protect our people's future. What terms? Kinpuash asked. Safe passage to the reservation for all our people. Protection from reprisals. The right to practice our traditional religion and maintain our cultural identity. The chief's eyes found Addie's face. And amnesty for all who have aided us, including our white medicine woman. Addie felt her heart skip. She had been so focused on saving the Modoc warriors that she'd almost forgotten her own precarious position. Without protection, surrendering would mean trading one death sentence for another. You think the army will agree to those terms? She asked. They will if the negotiation is handled properly, Chief Hasanonda replied. And I believe I know exactly the right person to handle it. He was looking directly at her. Me? But I'm wanted by the civil authorities. I can't just walk into an army camp, can't you? The chief smiled slightly. You are a white woman who has proven herself worthy of our trust. You understand both worlds, speak both languages. Who better to bridge the gap between us? The logic was compelling, but the risks were enormous. If the negotiations failed, she would face charges of treason and collaboration. But if she succeeded, she would save both the Modoc people and her own life. 2 days later, she rode alone toward the army encampment, carrying a white flag and a letter from Chief Hasanonda requesting parley. Behind her, hidden in the deep canyons, the surviving Modoc warriors waited to learn whether their trust had been justified or fatal. The army camp was a model of military efficiency. Colonel Wheaton was a career soldier in his 50s, with the weathered face of a man who had spent decades on the frontier. His aide, Lieutenant Morrison, was the same officer who had led the pursuit into the lava beds. Mrs. Weston, Colonel Wheaton said, his voice carefully neutral. You are wanted by territorial authorities for harboring fugitives. I should have you arrested immediately. But you won't, Addie replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Because I'm offering you something more valuable than one prisoner. I'm offering you the end of this war. The negotiations lasted 3 days. Addie had to convince the military commanders that accepting surrender was preferable to continuing. A costly campaign already drawing criticism from Washington. She had to address concerns about setting precedents and find solutions to complex legal problems. There were moments when the talk seemed on the verge of collapse, when pride and prejudice threatened to override pragmatism. But gradually, painfully, an agreement took shape. The Modoc people would return to the reservation with guarantees of adequate food and medical care. They would be allowed to practice their traditional religion. The leaders would face trial, but fair trials with proper representation. As for Addie, she would receive a presidential pardon. The charges would be dropped, and she would be free to resume her life. Chief Hasanonda rode into the army camp on a crisp autumn morning to formally surrender. The ceremony was conducted with military precision and mutual respect. The war chief handed over his rifle to Colonel Wheaton, who accepted it with appropriate gravity. You have fought with honor, the colonel said. Your courage has been noted and will be remembered. We fought for our homeland, for our people, Chief Hasanonda replied. We were not defeated in battle. We chose to end the bloodshed so that our children might live to see another sunrise. As the Modoc people prepared for their journey to the Reservation. Kinpuwash approached Addie one final time. His wounds had healed well, but there was sadness in his dark eyes that spoke of dreams deferred and freedoms lost. "What will you do now, battle sister?" he asked. Addie looked around at the camp, at soldiers packing equipment and Ings gathering their possessions. "I don't know," she said honestly. "My old life is gone. I can't go back to being the person I was before all this started." "You could come with us," Kinpuwash said quietly. "You would be welcome among our people, honored as the woman who helped save us from destruction." The offer was tempting, but Addie knew it wasn't the right path. "I think my role is to stay in the middle, to be the voice that speaks for understanding when others call for war, to be the healer who tends all wounds, regardless of the color of the skin that bears them." Kinpuwash nodded, understanding. The world has need of such bridges. He pulled out a small object, a piece of obsidian carved into the shape of a bear, polished to mirror brightness. "This was my grandfather's. He said it would bring protection to those who walk between worlds." Addie accepted the gift with reverence. "I'll treasure it always. And I will treasure the memory of the white woman who became my battle sister, who faced spirits and soldiers with equal courage." Kinpuwash smiled. "You have become something new, Adelaide Weston. Something the world has never seen before." As the column moved out across the high desert, Addie stood alone on the ridge overlooking the lava beds. The Forbidden Valley was invisible from here, hidden in the maze of volcanic stone. But she could feel its presence, could remember the spirits she had faced and the truths she had discovered about herself. She was no longer the woman who had pulled a wounded warrior from the shadows of her woodshed. That person had died in the fires of transformation, replaced by someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more capable. She had become a bridge between worlds, a healer who could face both earthly and supernatural threats, a negotiator who could find common ground between bitter enemies. The frontier was changing, and she would change with it. There would be other conflicts, other wounded souls in need of healing, other impossible negotiations that required someone who understood the hearts of both peoples. She mounted her horse and rode toward the horizon, toward a future that held infinite possibilities. Behind her, the lava beds kept their secrets, and the spirits whispered her name in languages older than memory. She had sheltered a bleeding Modoc warrior from a sheriff's posse, and in doing so had discovered who she was truly meant to be. The transformation was complete, and the legend had just begun.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.